Now, what has been happening in the past 20 years is that the rich, or let me call them the 1%, have been slowly taken over the government. So, who has the power? Who decides what is happening in the world, in your country, in your economy? Well, it's not the government. It's the 1%. And why? Because they bought the government, basically. Look at the US. You have this famous movie, Whack the Dog, and everybody is quite open about it in the US. Whoever has the most money wins the elections, which should make you, very much afraid. How can you say that and smile? That is just the end of democracy. If you can buy elections, you do not have a democracy. And well, now with Trump, before it might have been more covert, but now it's overt. Trump is definitely, well, maybe he's not rich enough to be part of the 1% because, well, they're not actually the 1%, they're the 0.001%. But I call them the 1%. And Trump is aspiring to be part of that because he's only, his worth is only 4 billion, which is a paltry sum in that world. And but he is expected to make another 24 billion in the next 2 years, just through his stablecoin companies. And then because he's abusing his position as president, people are throwing money at him and lending him money, etc., etc. So he is quite openly, through hook and crook and blackmail and whatever, is accumulating wealth. And if you look at his actions, in fact, it seems like almost 100% of all his actions are to get more money personally. He doesn't really seem to give any thought to the US or what's happening to people. But anyway, Trump is a puppet, and a puppet of the 1%. People like Musk, they're the 1%, Bezos, but also Putin, Xi, the Prince of Saudi Arabia. If you want, just Google or look on the internet, and you'll find the most. The richest people on the planet, and those are the 1%, and those people rule the planet. And they just bought the United States when they bought Trump. But they've owned the United States government more or less, at least have a great influence for a long time. And they didn't just buy the Republican politicians; they bought the Democrats as well. To them, it doesn't really matter whether it's Democrat or Republican. They basically, the 1% wants two things. It's really easy. They want two things. They want more money. And they want no interference. They want to be free to do whatever they want, and especially not be held by the rule of law. And you can see the way Trump is acting, that in the US at least, the 1% and the rich and powerful are not held by the rule of law, they can do basically everything, and they're not gonna be prosecuted, and they can buy their way out of everything, and they can even use their money to blackmail everybody into doing exactly what they want. So right now, the U.S. government is almost completely bought by the 1%. They own them, whether by bribing them or blackmailing them or whatever. You can clearly see that government policy across the board is no taxes for the rich and no rule of law for the rich. They got exactly what they wanted. And apart from that, most politicians are pretty free to do whatever they want as long as they please the 1%. So with Trump being so blatantly king-like in his behavior, and ruling the country together with his friends, these midterm elections are the last possibility for the American people to take back power and elect those officials who are not owned by the 1%, who are not blackmailed by the 1%, who are not bribed by the 1%, but who actually run on a platform which includes two things, or three. First of all, tax the rich, because we have a huge government deficit and the government needs to find more income, and you're already taxing the poor, so how are you going to get more income? You tax the 1%, the rich guys, and the big companies. And second of all, you break the power of the big companies with antitrust legislation, exactly like the US did 100 years ago when they broke up the robber barons' big companies. Because companies like Google, Amazon, Meta, Alphabet, whatever, they're too big, they're too powerful, and they have a monopoly. So they own the market, so consumers have no chance of getting value for money that is being sucked dry with bad products. So tax the rich, tax the big companies, antitrust legislation, and forcing the 1% to abide by the rule of law by forcefully prosecuting them when they break the law. And and first of all, there have to be politicians who are willing to run on a platform like that, and then the American people have to vote for these politicians. And the 1% are going to do everything they can to stop people from voting. Trump has already announced that he's going to rig the elections, going to commit fraud, going to do everything in his power, and his MAGA constituency, his followers. They're already moving into all the committees and changing bylaws and just doing everything they can so they can influence and rig the elections. So Trumpist candidates win. So that means that not only do you need an anti-1% politician, you also need to vote for him and make him win by a large margin. Maybe it's more than 10% difference with the other candidate, because there's going to be a lot of fraud. And so you need a lot more votes to get your man in. But you still can. And the 1% will start smear campaigns, and your candidate will be blackballed, and your candidate will not have a lot of money. So a lot of people are going to have to volunteer and help these candidates build websites and make it known, especially among the poor communities. This candidate is here and he's anti 1%. He's going to fix the problem. That was my phone call. And I think these midterms are maybe the last chance you have of restoring democracy and breaking the power of the 1% in the US. Because MAGA people and Trump people and 1% people are moving into all the election, the whole election system, and they will be able to influence this one, but the next one, like in 3 years' time, they'll have 3 years to not just influence it, but rig it completely. And the 1% had so much money. You do not understand. The 1% in the world own 90%, that is 90% of all the assets. You're up against, this is not just David and Goliath. This is David against 1,000 Goliaths. This is a massive struggle. But, well, if anybody can do it, it's the US, because they won the War of Independence, and they were up against Mad King George, which is now Trump. I always think of him as Mad King George because, well, he actually is mad. And look at him; he's obviously senile, and they must be paying his doctors a lot of money to proclaim him fit, because it is so obvious to everybody. His last speech in Davos, you couldn't make heads and tails of it. He was just blabbering total nonsense. This guy, his brain is just fried, and he's falling down, and I think they're going to be hard pressed to keep him alive until November. But then you have Vance, but basically Vance is not a person of power. No, after Trump, his sons will take over, and it's quite obvious that Trump will probably not live until the next election, or not be coherent to walk and talk at the next elections. And it'll be a lot of problems. But he'll just do what Bush did, what the Kennedys did, his son will run. And his son is a nice, good-looking, young, reasonably young man, and elegant, and part of the 1%. So I think it is quite possible that his son will run for president, Junior. And even if he were to run today, I think he would win, because he has all the money of the 1% behind him. It's just, you need to realize the 1% is not just Musk and Bezos. It is Putin. It is the Saudi Arabia rulers and princes. There are a lot of very rich people all around the world. So if you want to understand why things are happening, you need to realize that all the power in the world is with the 1%. And they own almost any government, every government. Now, tyrannical governments he owns because he simply buys the tyrant it is so easy, you just give him some bitcoins and a Swiss bank account, a couple of million here and there, and you own this tyrant government. The problem lies with democratic governments where you have to get your guy elected. But the whole American system is making it very easy and has made it very easy for the 1% to take over. In fact, the only countries where they're having trouble is in countries where they have more than two parties, where they have a multi-party system. And the power is divided among so many parties and politicians that it's difficult to buy all of them. And then they disagree with each other and they fight, and it's really very difficult for the 1% to control it. So what has been happening? So what do the 1% want? Well, power and to be left alone and not to be bothered by anybody else telling them what to do. No laws, no regulations, nothing. Free to pay pauper wages, to pay very small wages, free to pollute the environments, to loot the environments, to exploit people and countries. That's what they want to do, and they have one goal: more money, which means maximize profit, because they're all big companies and big businesses. So basically, forever, but let's look at the since the 80s, all over the world, there's a struggle going on between government and the 1%. And who's government? Well, government is the people. It is the 99. It is you and me. That is government. So it has been the 1% versus the 99. Now, in a democratic country, the 99 are the voters who vote for the democratic representatives. And in those countries, it has been quite difficult for the 1% to buy the politicians and the government. But at least they can influence it through lobbyists and supporting certain candidates, etc. So what has been consistent policies by most governments in the world, that is to not tax the 1%, the big companies, giving them tax cuts, evasions, tax havens, all that stuff. They're moving the companies around and the money around, and the governments are helping them. But another major strategy of the 1% to take over government is to weaken the government. You weaken your enemy. How do you do that? Well, you persuade them to borrow more and more and more money. And then you have crisis this and crisis that and COVID, and the governments are persuaded to bail out the governments and the people, the companies and the people, and borrow money to bail out. And that is why the US debt, but also the EU debt and the UK debt and the Japan debt has gone up exponentially because of 2008 crisis and COVID. And they've been borrowing a lot of money and pouring it into the economy to keep things going. The only thing is, neoliberalism says if the government spends money, pours money into society, into the country, then it'll trickle down and all the people will benefit. And that is the trick, because that is not true. Let me emphasize that the government borrows a huge amount of money, trillions, for COVID, for the credit crisis in 2008. They pour it into the economy and it does not trickle down. And because the 1% are just this big hoover in the sky and it's sucking up all the money into that is in the economy. And what is the result? The rich get richer, but the poor get poorer. The gap between rich and poor becomes bigger and bigger and bigger. And you have this wonderful K-shaped economy, and K-shaped society. And the bigger the gap, the easier it becomes for the rich to suck up all the money and all the assets. And that is why house prices have been going up and the stock exchange is going up and gold is going up. Everything that's an asset is going up. Why? Because the 1% are buying it. And they just, in 2008 and during COVID, the government gave them a shitload of money. And what did they do? They bought assets. So house prices went up even more. And ordinary people had to sell their houses. And now a lot of people can't afford a house anymore, especially young people. And the gap just widens and widens and widens. So basically, what the 1% is doing is they're sucking out the money out of the economy. They're sucking it out of ordinary people, especially the middle class, and they're sucking it out of the government. Because every time the government borrows and pours it into the economy, it just gets sucked up into this great hoover in the sky, and the 1%, they buy assets, and the companies get bigger and bigger and bigger because they buy all the small companies and all the research and development, so they get bigger and bigger and bigger, so they don't have to provide service. Most of the companies are monopolists. So as a consumer, we're completely powerless. There's nothing we can do about it. And they are raising prices, like Meta is now going to ask money, monthly subscriptions for WhatsApp, for Facebook. And because they're the monopolists, these huge companies who dominate the markets, we have to pay more and more and more. So they persuaded the government to invest, to borrow a lot of money and pour it into the economy, telling them that they were helping ordinary people, which they weren't, because all that money was going to the 1%, and the gap widens. But now the government is in trouble because they borrowed and borrowed and borrowed and borrowed, and now the US is going broke. They've come to a point where they borrowed so much they can't pay their debt. Japan is in great trouble. Their debt to GDP ratio is over 200%, which is just unbelievable. America is 38 trillion in debt and failing. The UK is in really bad shape. France can't even balance their budget. They can't. Parliament is hopelessly tight because they have so much debt and not enough money to pay for it. So all over the world, governments are being sucked out and destroyed, basically. So we have, and government is the 99. When we're talking about a democratic government, we're talking about the 99. We're talking about the people who vote for their representatives. So it actually is the power of the people, the 99, versus the power of the 1%. And that is the battle that is raging right now. And if the 99 lose control over the government, which they're about to do, they're in real trouble, because then they lose democracy. When the 99 lose their power, they lose democracy. Democracy is power of the people. And especially in the US, they're on the brink, you know. Trump obviously won because he had more money, and they're openly declaring that they're going to fraud and rig the next elections. So the U.S. is on the brink, not just of losing the democracy, but of on the brink of bankruptcy and on the brink of a second Great Depression. And then you say, but why? Why would the 1% want this Great Depression? Well, they want the whole system to crash because they have the money. And if they have the money and the rest of the world is going broke, what's going to happen? A whole load of assets, houses, property, commercial property, small companies, bigger middle-class companies, banks, the whole banking system is going to go broke. So banks, they are going to be very cheap to buy. And then the 1% can swoop in with all the gold they got stashed. And they'll swoop in and they'll buy all the assets they don't own yet. They own 90% of the world's asset, but they want the rest of it too. So that is the big picture. We're seeing a war over assets. Who owns what? So who has the power on what? Between the 1% and the 99. And the 99 are the people, the power of the people, and the democratic governments. Because the only ones who are able to fight back, to push back at the 1% and take back the assets, so the middle class can grow again, so the middle class can own their house again and pay the decent wage again and buy a car again. And the whole thing that we had in the 60s and 70s can only come back if the 99 push back and take back what the 1% has sucked out of the economy. Basically, tax the rich, give it to the poor, and force them to pay decent wages and to invest in the country's economy and create jobs and antitrust, so they lose their monopoly, and there's a vibrant market where consumers can get good and low prices and good service, and then we can restart the whole thing again like we did in the 50s, and then the middle class will grow again, we'll own our houses again, and the whole thing will become, the world will become more a wonderful place to live, like it was before the 1% sucked up all our money. So yeah, it is a real battle, because only the democratically chosen government by the 99, power to the people, can introduce legislation to tax the rich, antitrust, and force them to abide by the law and invest in the energy transition, cleaning up the environment, and paying decent wages and creating jobs. The only one who can do that is the government. So that's why the 1% are destroying the government by inducing them, persuading them to borrow more and more until they go broke. And that is why they buy any government they can find to prevent them being taxed and sharing their power and wealth with the 99. Because, any reasonable person would say, well, we're all in this boat together with this big planet, and we shouldn't have 1% who own everything and 99 who are poor and starving and homeless and jobless because the AI and robots have taken all our jobs, and we're starving in the streets. That shouldn't be. We, the people, we should take power and say, we want a piece of this pie that 1% need to share with everybody because we're all together. And so I think the people need to know that they're running out of time, and the US government is on the verge of going broke. And that means that then the 1% can buy up all the assets for a very low price. And the 99, the people will lose their democracy. So take back the power. You are the people.